said, okay. And he went out and spoke for about 5 minutes, and he came back in and he said, it's all yours. And I said, it's supposed to speak for an hour. And he goes, I know, but I've been in prisons and I won't do that. So he spoke for 5 minutes and left, and then sent me out to talk for about an hour. And my experience when I first got out there was there's a large room, maybe 4 times as large as this room, packed. Obviously, there was a little bit of incentive for them to be there. I don't think there was a popularity vote for me that they were all there. And I recognize that. And right down the middle of the aisles, across and down, there's a gap of about 6 feet. And they have uniformed guards with rifles, like shotguns, at every corner. And I noticed they had them broken up by ethnicity. So they'd have the blacks, the Latinos, the Asians, and the whites, all separate. And then they say, okay, go get them, go motivate them. And I thought, with that background, just about anywhere else I go, I really find it light. It's really light. So I'm glad to be here. And now that you know that story, you know I really mean it. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the legal system. We've got approximately an hour and a half of time to talk, I understand, so we're going to take a break. So I selected a few of the most salient, compelling aspects of the legal system that I want to share with you. I know that most of you know a lot about the law just from living here, growing up here. You know, traffic laws and things like that. You've had to work, so you know about contracts. Maybe you've had car accidents or been hurt at work, just the everyday stuff. And by the way, not to flood the book, but that's basically why this was written, as always, A to Z of your life when you're here. But lately, I noticed that the population is at last becoming more and more interested with the legal system and how it works and why it works, and in fact, when it doesn't work. And we have a lot of examples of that you read about in the paper every day. I teach a legal subjects class here at Cal State Fullerton in the evening, and one of the assignments I do the very first night of class is I tell the students that by next class, I want them to select one newspaper, one day, go through from cover to cover, and cut out every article that in any way relates to a legal subject. And they have no idea at the time how comprehensive that assignment is. They figure out, cut out a couple of articles from looking to find one, and when they come in, they have a stack of anywhere from 15 to 25 articles out of one day only in only one newspaper. And that's just like either the time to the register here. And the idea for that is for them to start understanding how much everything that we touch and care about is affected by our legal system. And after that experience, they realize, in fact, they write little notes to me and they say, I had no idea how much and how pervasive the law is in our lives. And we're going to go over some things that will give you, illustrate that concept to you. The law actually touches everything from before we're born till after we're dead in our lives. Before you're born, laws that determine what doctors have to do to get licensed to deliver, right? Everything in the hospital that awaits you to deal with, you have to pass all kinds of legal tests about quality control and importation and everything else. And even after you die, whether it's by cremation or burial or any other way, there's a lot of strict rules and regulations and laws just about how you can be taken care of after you pass. There's all, students, especially university students, are very creative, and they always have a lot of questions. And whenever I tell them something like this, there's always a hand or two that goes up. And they feel intellectually challenged, I guess, when I say something like that. I say, did you say it touches everything in your life? And when I hear that, I know that here comes a challenge, and I go, yes, it touches everything in your life. It can't control what I think. What do you think? Can the law control what you think? Can the law in any way regulate or affect your thoughts?
Oh, sure.
Now, anybody have an idea?
Yes.
Now,
It sets a whole framework of the way you perceive things.
but in terms of the legal system, because the challenge is basically that's the one area in my life that not even the law is going to be able to touch, and that's my mind. And yet, unfortunately, that's not true. What is true is that, we had a great example of it that just ended in a tragic jury verdict 2 days ago, the Andrea Yates case. Anybody watching that?
Yep.
The lady who was down with 5 kids. What was the only compelling issue in that case? I mean, nobody doubted what happened, but there was one reason that that case went to trial, right?
Sanity.
And what does sanity relate to? Your mind, right? What you were or weren't thinking, what you did or didn't intend, and the law says, depending on what's in there, you either get this result Well, you get this result, right? So you can start to visualize how it's not true that that one, last reservoir of liberty and individuality of yours in your mind and in mine is somehow unaffected by the law. Even that is affected by the law. I became passionate about the law when I was in the 6th grade, and that's when I first told my older brother, I'm going to be a lawyer. And of course, after the laughing died down, it was laughter for the next many, many years, because little Chicano kids in El Paso, Texas, in the lobby with tattoos on their arms didn't grow up to be lawyers, so my brothers just snuffed it off as a 12-year-old kid with his dream. But I realized, after seeing some examples in the neighborhood and in school, that there was this very powerful concept that I had trouble dealing with, called unfairness. And I thought, how do you deal with unfairness? I mean, the human nature to not be fair, because that is part of the human experience, isn't it? That there's a lot of people who just aren't willing to be fair. And you've seen it, kids bullying other kids. You see people lying in court because they want to win more money or less money or don't want to go to jail. And so I figured one of the toughest things for me to live with as a human being is this whole concept of unfairness. And people are unfairly favored or disfavored, or unfairly convicted, or unfairly cut out of a good job that they could do, but for a number of reasons. And I finally realized that that was so important to me that somehow I had to figure out a way to be part of this system of justice, because that's what we're talking about, the justice system. Now, I have been fortunate enough, after practicing law for a few years, as Leonard pointed out, since 1976, to have been able to travel a lot. I've traveled to Canada, Europe, Latin America, all over the United States. And I make it a point to try to learn about the way laws differ in different locations, different countries, different ways of doing things, because I'm constantly comparing. Because I'm proud of the fact that I still believe that this is absolutely the best system of justice in the world, criminal or civil justice system. Far from perfect. I know we've got a lot of problems that come out, and sometimes what goes in the justice system doesn't come out right. We've got a lot of examples of that, but by and large, our system is the closest thing to perfect that there really is. In Latin America, for example, the priority in dealing with the justice system is the security of the community. Everything else is secondary. Okay? The main thing is to protect the public from wrongs or danger. The U.S. is a lot different. Anybody have an idea what our main priority is? Individual rights and freedoms, right? Because in our country, the legal maxim is far better that 10 people who are guilty go free than one innocent person go to prison. I don't know how you feel about it personally, but I think that that makes more sense to me. The thought of one person not doing something, being in prison for 19 years, like this guy in the newspaper about a month ago, was named Dwayne McKinney, convicted of murder, and DNA clears him now after 19 years. Very good-natured fellow. I understand he went and looked up Tony Lapacas, and he said, I know mistakes were made, but thank you for not appealing this thing once you found out that I was innocent. And it speaks a lot about someone like that who's going to be away for 20 years, and then he says, no harm, no foul. Thank God you didn't keep me there 3 more years during my appeal to get me out. So mistakes do happen. And you're right. In the U.S., the individual freedoms and rights are even superior to the community safety. We think we reconcile them quite well, and I think so. Let me give you an example of a problem and how they would be treated differently. Midnight, a person breaks into a house, assaults somebody, gets the purse, and runs out of the house, running through the neighborhood. Immediately calls on the police, and scenario number 1 is in the United States. They finally arrest a person based on the person's description, and they have him in a cell. Don't find any of the evidence. They don't find a purse. They have this person who meets the description. He is a male Latino between 20 and 25 with a mustache. That's the description, and they have one in custody. Scenario number 2, this happens in Mexico City, Colombia, Peru, El Salvador, Guatemala, etc. Same thing happens. They immediately do a dragnet about 4 miles of perimeter, and they start working in, and they arrest everybody from that description. How many people do you think they're going to have in Mexico City or Colombia that fits that description?
Half the
Yeah. All of a sudden, they've got 39 people in custody, and they all meet that description. Now, in our country, of course, we say we've only got 72 hours to come up with enough probable cause to file and charge him, get him arraigned before his court, or we got to let him go. And think about it, if you're the one who's sitting there, and presume for the moment you're not guilty, but you meet the description, and you're now wondering, how long am I going to be here? Which country would you rather be in? In Latin America, the way it goes, and by the way, I lecture sometimes for the Tijuana Bar, Mexico City Bar, and those lawyers think we're crazy. Crazy gringos, man, how do they do this? And why? Because I said, well, what do you do? Well, what we do is, we have everybody keep them locked up because we know that if we let them out, one of them is guilty. And one of them is likely to do it tonight. And he'll hurt somebody, he'll rob something, he'll do the same thing. So it's our duty to protect the community. So we know it's one of them. And so we're not going to let anybody out until we find out which one it is. And I said, well, what if it takes you 6 months and you don't still have enough evidence? Well, then we just keep looking until we get some more evidence. Well, what if it's a year and you don't have enough evidence? Well, we just have to keep working at it. We'll assign 2 or 3 cops and investigators, and sooner or later, we've got to come up with the evidence. But worst case scenario, a year and a half goes by. You still don't have enough evidence to charge anybody. Well, what do you do? Well, at that point, we get them all in a room and we tell them, you guys are very lucky. We know you did it, and we're going to let you go this time. And we'll let them go. But for a year and a half, until the process gets there, they keep them there. That's just one example of the differences between our way of doing things and other countries' ways of doing things. Read in the newspaper, I cut out a lot of newspaper articles, the death penalty. You know, we deal with the death penalty. You all know probably that we're one of maybe 4 or 5 countries in the world that have a death penalty. A lot of countries don't. And some of the arguments against it are, the only other countries besides the U.S. that have it are like China, Iran, places like that, right? So I read in the newspaper and I realized that I read the selection international rulings and court cases, and they executed a bank president for embezzling from his bank the sum of approximately $100,000. Got the death penalty for that. 2 weeks later, China again, they executed another guy. He was an engineer who engineered a bridge, a suspension bridge. And he was corrupt, took some bribes, he used inferior materials, and it gave away, and 2 people were killed. Now, you say, yeah, but 2 people were killed. But really, is it the same as murder? I mean, you say instead of grade 5 metal, I'm buying grade 3 metal, I save a couple of bucks, I pocket the money. Is that the same as saying, I'm going to kill somebody? And yet that was enough to execute somebody. That was basically, you're corrupt, you violated the law, someone died, and so that equates with capital offense and you get killed. Those are the kind of things that make me appreciate every day how lucky we are to live in this country. Now, starting with the history of the way we became, you all know this, I'm sure, but when the Constitution was framed, it was based out of a reaction to a really bad situation that they came from, right? They said, my God, I saw some gory stuff, so when we come here, this is our own place now. We'll make the rules. And so they fashioned the rules, basically cleaning up the problems that they came from. So they didn't have to deal with forced religion and things like that. You could have free speech and all the things that we valued. And it's very well thought out, but having rules is one thing, applying them fairly is another. So we might have we do have the best rules in the world, but some of the players in the system are not quite as perfect. And that's why you have lying witnesses and lying, even people on both sides of the legal process have been caught lying. Defense attorneys, prosecutors, police officers, judges have been corrupt. Not as much as in other countries, but certainly it happens here. It's important to know that it's very difficult to change the basic concepts of our legal system. It's important to know that because if we could just willy-nilly change laws or have coups and replace people at the point of a gun, none of us would feel very secure. But we know, for example, the Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land, Even Congress can't just pass a law to contravene constitutional principles, we know that. To give you an example of how hard it is to change them, anybody know how many amendments we have to the Constitution? How many amendments to the original Constitution we have? Close. 27. But the first 10 happened right at the time of the Constitution, right? So there was only really 17 after that. And 2 of those had to do with the same subject. Anybody know what that was?
Prohibition.
Alcohol, you're right. Prohibition and the repeal of prohibition. So 2 of the 17 had to do with one subject. That only leaves 15 other ones. So 15 times in the history since we had the Constitution that we've changed or added to the Constitution. And the reason for that is when they started it out, they said, we know this is what's important to us. And so we're going to do that. Now, sometimes you shake your head and you say, if you can have a constitutional amendment, that's a very elaborate process to get enough legislatures and enough people to vote for an amendment to get it done. Does anybody remember the Equal Rights Amendment that was attempted? You know, somebody remember about that? When was that? The 70s? Yeah, the ERA? The 70s, right? Now, it was 70s, I believe. And the process, it was 7 years. They had a 7-year window to get enough votes in each of the houses of the states to pass it. And it actually had an additional 2 years in most amendments because there was an extension. And you think about the subject matter of that for a minute. You say, what did it purport to do? Who remembers what the purpose was of the ERA? Equal Rights Amendment? Yes.
Basically, it's a very short amendment, which meant denied the right based on sex.
That's it. You can't be denied any rights based on sex. Very straightforward. Remarkably simple with it. Now, in fact, weren't you kind of amazed that that couldn't get through the process? I mean, we did it twice on alcohol. You know, we got everybody together in this whole country and passed an amendment for prohibition. And then when it didn't work, we got everybody together and said, it didn't work, okay, you can drink again, right? But for something like that, you can't discriminate against somebody on the basis of sex. Was not able to be put through in 7 years. So yeah, that's when you shake your head. We have to shake our head a lot sometimes. Again, when you say, do we have mistakes in the system? Supreme Court justices voided a 1996 murder verdict because it was wrong. The murder verdict got turned around. By the way, last year there were 90 death row reversals in the country. 90 last year. Where people were on death row and they found some problems with the evidence. By the way, a lot of the things that you'll notice if you ever cut out the sentencing that goes on for different offenses. This is a deadly drunk driver was given 12 years after he killed somebody in drunk driving. 12 years on this one. Three strikes law, that's another one. Anybody familiar with the three strikes law?
Yep.
Not personally.
You haven't seen it in effective personally, but you know about it, right? What do you know about the three strikes law?
You're out.
You're in.
You're
Read
in.
about it?
Three strikes and you're in.
3 strikes and something happens. No?
Yeah, you're in.
3 strikes.
You're in for life.
Right.
25 to life. And does it matter what the third strike is about?
Nope.
No. When they first introduced it, we were led to believe that they had to be serious crimes.
And violent crimes.
Violent
Yes.
crimes. And so people voted for it.
You're right. And
Now you steal a pack of cigarettes.
you're right. There's been several real cases. The pizza, like one who took a piece of pizza from another guy, and the one who broke into the church and stole some bread. Same thing, 3 strikes, and off he went. So now, luckily, society is having to deal with whether we did the right thing or not, and if not, what do we do about it?
Well, that's certainly debatable, but when a person's a criminal, regardless of what he does, there's a chance that his life or he does accidentally.
Well, not even accidentally. I mean, the law contemplates that these are people who commit crimes, and crimes are specific intent crimes. If you don't intend to do it, it's a whole different category of an offense. So the law says if you commit a crime, the third time you commit it, then the first 2, of course, have to be serious felonies. The third one is the problem. The third one is now, and the examples that are up on appeal is the guy who was clean for 20 years after having 2 felonies, and then the third one is something very minor like the pizza. And he said, no, the law is the law is the law. This is the third one. It doesn't have to be violent or serious. It's a third one, and we figure you're never going to get it straight, so off you go for 25 to life. Yes, there are. And that basically, we have a maxim in the law that says bad facts makes bad law. And if facts are bad enough, judges and juries bend over backwards to try to make sure that a good result results in this case on these facts. Unfortunately, when you have that result, it becomes precedent under the law. And now people use it to apply to future cases where the facts may not be as compelling. And that's why you got to be very careful that the facts of this present case are not so emotionally compelling that you bend the rules and come out with a legal precedent that'll come back to haunt you later. Our legal system and our laws are based on our values and our moral system here. You all recognize that when we do things like the death penalty, it represents our moral system to the world and to ourselves. Whether we believe, as a majority of us, that there are certain acts bad enough to justify taking someone's life officially as under color of law. Everything in our laws are based on the same thing, our moral system. If we don't believe it's right, we either don't create such a law, or we repeal it when we finally agree that it's not right. And there's a lot of examples of this. From day one in our country until 1973, it was always unlawful to have an abortion. Remember that, right? Pre-1973, you could not have an abortion. And I have to admire the attorney who listened to her client for those days, and it took years to get to the Supreme Court. The actual case wasn't filed in 73. It finally got to the process at the end of 73. But it was so well established and entrenched in the law that you could not have an abortion under any circumstances for a couple hundred years. And all of a sudden, a lady walks into her lawyer and says, I need your help. I want to get an abortion. She said, you're in the wrong office. I'm a lawyer. Doctors are down the street. He said, no, I want to have an abortion, but I want it to be legal. I said, well, sorry, I'm a lawyer. I can tell you it's not legal. He said, I know that, but I want it to be legal. I think it's right. I think it should be legal. And let me tell you why. And at the end of the conversation, the lawyer said, you know, you make a lot of sense. I agree with you. It probably should be legal. But it's still against the law. And finally, the question came, will you please represent me and somehow get it to the Supreme Court and see if we can get a decision that says it is legal, because I don't want to have one unless it's legal. And it shocked the legal community when the Supreme Court came back and said, under these circumstances, you can now have a legal abortion. People were shocked, because we've had a Supreme Court for 200 years, and the issue had gone up several times. And every time the answer was no. How do you explain the fact that prior Supreme Courts had said no, and this Supreme Court in 1973 said yes? How do you explain that?
You were smart.
Who's right, who's wrong, and what happened? Anybody got an idea?
The culture changed.
Exactly. Exactly. Don't you think the Supreme Court justices understand what's going on in their community? They talk to their wives, their kids, their neighbors. They go to bazaars and bar mitzvahs and everything else, and they get a feel for what's going on, what's the buzz. They read newspapers. And prior to 1973, no Supreme Court justice in his right mind would have said, I want to vote for the right to a woman to have an abortion. But there came a time when it was socially not just acceptable, but almost socially compelling to do it. And when they looked around at each other and said, well, what do you think in those days? What do you think, guys? Right?
Yeah.
Right.
So the answer was, let's give the old gal a break. The old boy single. Because that's how it's been. When they decided to do it, it finally happened. Now, does that mean that forever there's going to be the right to an abortion in this country? Are we guaranteed that because they said it in 73, thank God that's forever?
No.
You think that's the way it goes?
No.
Why not? Yeah, they're changing Supreme Court justice. In fact, right now it's hanging 5-4. And right now it's a 5-4 split on the issue of abortion. So, you know, the next one When someone retires, the next one could go 5-4 the other way. It's very close. And so you're starting to understand that the legal system is a composite of our values and moral system with a conduit of the political system. Because the political system is the machine that's used to spit out legislation. Okay? And that's why it's so important to understand the process that we're working with. If you ever want to have something that's important to you either become law or get rejected or repealed. Another good example of that was 1954. Anybody familiar with the case of Brown versus the Board of Education?
Yep.
What was involved with that?
Separate but equal.
Separate but equal, referring to what?
Schools.
School.
Education. Prior to that, what was the concept that was acceptable?
That you could separate you could separate groups of people as long as you provided them with an equal education.
Yeah, and of course, equal in that context, was it factually true?
Absolutely not.
And so sooner or later, that became the knowledge of the movement. And people at one point said, you know, this is not right. And it took a couple of lawyers to finally say, enough. Much like what happened in the Rosa Parks thing on the buses. You saw the story 2 or 3 weeks ago on TV, right? The Rosa Parks story. And the point being, that's one of the most refreshing parts of knowing that we live in this country. That even though we have horrendous incidents in our history, because humanity has the examples of its best and its worst all over the world. You know, we're not spared by having some perverts and some deviants in our society just because it's the U.S. of A. I mean, we've got some bad people too, just like everybody else. That's why we have to have laws. But despite that, it's good to know that when we finally recognize and someone screams to the Supreme Court and says, look, this isn't right, that there is a way to get it changed. When I was a kid growing up in high school, many times in my career as a student, all the way from elementary to high school, it was a common experience. Teacher to be teaching and then just say, Frank Martinez would come up, bend over, you get a big board, smack! 4 or 5 times. Put the board down, Frank sits down, keeps on talking about Texas history. 20 minutes later, Bill, talking, over, gets the board, whacks him, puts the board down, even look at him. Bill picks it down. Sometimes it was me. Could that happen today?
No.
Why? It doesn't, does it? It doesn't, and the reason is it's now against the law. Now, I think what happened, and I'm sure the way it happened, was some kid goes home, with bruises, can hardly walk, and one parent in that community finally said, what is wrong with you? Well, never mind, it was my fault. No, what was your fault? Why are you walking that way? And some parent finally said, this is outrageous. This is absolutely outrageous that my kids go to school and someone else can take a board from without me being there and know what it's about. The next stop is Board of Education, City Council, State Senate, and before you know it, there's people clamoring and say we cannot have people being hit with boards in our school when they're 10 years old. And of course, the law has changed, and now we don't have corporal punishment. But I don't know how many of you actually saw it applied or had it applied. But you did too, huh? And I remember it became a way of life. My kids can't believe that there was actually a time when people would use a board on you in your classroom. And I got to tell you, it was such a common experience that nobody thought it was weird. You just get up, bend over, and you hit you, sit down, start taking notes again. Yeah, the religious schools do, yeah, the famous ruler of the hand. I remember that. Sometimes the progress and the evolution defies logic. Anybody know when blacks got the right to vote?
It was real weird.
1870, the 15th Amendment passed to the Constitution saying, have a right to vote. 60s was the Civil Rights Movement, a lot of other good things happened. But 1870, we passed the 15th Amendment to the Constitution saying blacks can vote. When did women get the right to vote? 1920. 1920. Now, this is think about it. People who are so involved with this concept of voting, right to vote, equal rights. They're all involved because it's not an easy process, as I told you, to pass a constitutional amendment. And so picture all these people in 1870 trying to figure out, is it time now to give blacks the right to vote? And they go through all this effort and finally say yes. And they didn't even think about, while we're at it, do you think maybe we ought to include women? Couldn't we put a paragraph B and say women too in 1870? Why does it take 50 years before someone says, you know, guys, in 1870, did blacks the right to vote? I think it's about time to give women the right to vote? Nah, let's go to the club for a while. We'll talk about serious things later. It took 50 years to get from blacks to vote to women to vote. So I'm telling you this so that you can start putting in the context of reality, of history, how our system works and doesn't work. Because we have some very good, powerful stuff, but we have some stuff that you just have to shake your head about once in a while and say, why? Why does that happen like that? It's good to know that our system provides for every one of you and me to have a personal, compelling, moral need and elevate it to an enforceable law. Every one of us can do that. And we've got a lot of examples of how that's happened recently. We spoke about the 3 strikes law. How do you think that came about? How did it actually happen that we just, anybody even said, you know what, we ought to have a 3 strikes law? Well, we ought to have a law that finally puts people away for a long, long time. Do you think that maybe a bunch of senators and assemblymen in California were sitting around Sacramento saying, God, I don't even know what they're doing, there's not much work to do, and why don't we just come up with some new law or something? What about something like a 3 strikes law?
No.
Well, that's certainly part of it. But actually, the 3 strikes law itself was propelled into the public eye and into the legislative halls, and then ultimately to a voter proposition. Remember, this was a proposition we voted on.
It was a family of I think, a kid who was killed by a ex-con.
Polly Klaas.
Oh.
Polly Klaas. The ex-con had already been convicted of child molestation, child sexual assault, child rape. Did about 10 years, and they released him. And within 2 weeks, kidnaps Polly Klaas, rapes her, and kills her. And the father and the community were so outraged that there was no containing that emotion, that justifiable outrage, that at this point everything went out the window except this compulsion to get it right, to never let this happen again. And that emotion spread all over the state, and finally we voted and said yes. There's got to be an end to it. There ought to be a law, and I'm voting yes. About 72% of the population that voted said yes, and we now have the 3 strikes law. Again, somebody pointed out that it was presented a little bit differently. And in fact, Polly Klaas's father now is saying that we need to modify 3 strikes because that wasn't what he understood it was going to be. He did not understand it to be that the 3rd strike could be any crime, no matter how minor or how lacking in violence. So he's actually flipped, much like the plaintiff and the lawyer both in the Roe versus Wade abortion case have changed. They basically now said, I'm not sure I was right there either. So they're having second thoughts about the law they created.
Statistically, how has it reduced crime, or has it reduced the crime rate?
There's different numbers on both sides of it. Probably the more legitimate ones is that it hasn't made a major difference, because if you compare it to states that don't have 3 strikes, the incidents percentage-wise are not different, and historically they haven't changed that much. So that's one of the arguments against it. I need a battery? See, a second. I can turn a page in that time. What would you do without experts? Yes, sir.
Has the 3 strikes law been contested in the state Supreme Court?
Yeah, several times on sub-issues. And both of the last 2 times, the appellants, the defendants who had it applied to them, were successful, thank you, were successful in whittling away a part of it. The first one had to do with whether it was constitutional under a separation of powers argument to allow a prosecutor in his sole discretion to decide whether to file this as a 3 strikes case or not. And it went up to the court and they said, you're right, it's not constitutional. You can't encroach into the judge's domain by depriving him of input into this process only by the prosecutor. The last one came out about 3 months ago, and that was a case where it went up and said, this is the punishment, 25 to life, is so disproportionate to stealing a piece of pizza from a guy that it really violates due process. It's totally beyond the realms of due process. And the court came back and said yes. And now judges can strike a strike. So if you file a 3 strikes case against somebody and you have to prove and allege the 2 prior strikes, you can actually strike one of them. And now this is the second one. And the way the 3 strikes law works is, on the second strike, you get double the punishment. So if it was a 5-year sentence, you get 10. And it's the 3rd strike now where you get 25 to life. But again, it's been watered down a little bit in the courts. And there's now a movement to actually do another initiative, another proposition, rewritten to basically explain the way we think, at least some people think, that the 3rd one has to also be at least a felony, a serious offense. Any other examples of how one person's pet peeve or injury can evolve into a law? Anybody heard about Megan's Law?
Yeah.
Anybody know what that is?
Yeah.
Sexual predators, what about them?
They now you have to be informed. The community has to be informed if they're living within the community.
That's right. For years, we have had sexual predators violators registration, where after they do their time, they have to register with the local police department. But now, under Megan's Law, and what happened in the Megan's Law case? Anybody know? What happened in that actual case, Megan's case? It was back east?
They moved in next door. Right.
Yep. Sexual predator released, the community wasn't notified, he moved in next door, and first opportunity takes Megan and violates her. And so at that point, again, outrage grew from the parents to the community, and before we know it, we now had not only the registration requirements, but the notification requirements. We've seen some of that here, haven't we? You've seen in the news where someone gets released, they move into some little community in Chino, and of course the police come and tell all the neighbors, you now have a visitor here living near the neighbor, and what happens? Do they have a welcoming party? Yeah, with placards and everything else, and before you know it, he has to move somewhere else, and it's repeated everywhere he goes. And the one last year ended up requesting to live in a very humble place on a state prison property. Not as a prisoner, but until they're figuring out how they're going to handle it, he basically is living on prison property in just a very small little shack, because he's afraid to move anywhere under the reporting requirements. And so there's a, believe it or not, there is a group organized on the other side saying, if you're going to give the guy 15 years, give him 15 years. But if you're going to have the Megan's Law going on, anywhere he goes, he's just constantly going to be moving. At some point, he's going to go underground. And when he does, now you've got the problems again, because he's going to say, heck with society, I can never pay my debt. So there's a group now organized to try to change it so that you don't necessarily tell everybody, guess who's living next door, he did this, because otherwise, at some point, he doesn't never pay his debt to society, and it ultimately ends up being another threat when he goes underground. Just so you know, that's also in the wings. Before Megan's Law and 3 strikes, there was a big movement that changed many laws throughout this country. Anybody know what MAD is?
Yes.
Yes.
What is it?
Drunk driving.
Mothers Against Drunk Drivers.
Now that was a long time coming. It wasn't like Polly Class and Megan's Law, where right away things started moving and everything blew up. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, by the time that happened, we had experienced 3 decades of people getting killed by drunk drivers. And what's the difference? Why did we take 30 years to finally bubble to the point if you say, ya basta?
Drinking was acceptable.
Yeah. Drinking was acceptable because the people who made the laws and enforced the laws, many of them said, you know, there's nothing wrong with drinking. It's not the booze that's the problem, it's the one violator. But I know a lot of great people who drink once in a while, and I've even seen people who get drunk once in a while. In fact, I've been drunk once in a while. In fact, right? And that's why it was so hard for people to be outraged. But sooner or later, when the mores started changing, less people were drinking. At some point, people said, there's got to be more to it than this. So as a result, MAD was formed, and they went on a spree of enacting many, many laws that affected the drunk driving process. Any examples of some of the basic laws that they changed?
Well, the bartender can be held responsible for continuing to serve.
That's a different concept. That's called dram shop backwards, vicarious liability, right, for doing things. But the actual direct drunk driving offense itself, before that, we used to have to be at a 0.10 or higher of blood alcohol in your system before you were considered intoxicated, right, under the influence. They lowered it to 0.08. That's a 20% drop in the blood alcohol content that it takes now before they can tag you for drunk driving. They have mandatory jail now, right? Mandatory loss of your license, mandatory drunk driving classes, alcohol alarms, all that stuff.
Mandatory testing if you're...
Mandatory testing, absolutely. And that all came because at one point, enough mothers came together and said, we've lost our kids, we don't want you guys to lose yours, and I don't want to lose another one. And so the bottom line here is that the system works if you work the system. But it's not a free ride. If everybody just keeps saying there ought to be a law, there ought to be a law, there ought to be a law, there's never going to be one. Somebody has to take the initiative and get up and go grab a senator and sit him down and say, listen to me. Here's my checkbook. This is what I expect you to do. And people say, that's crazy. You shouldn't have to buy justice. But you know, the way it works right now, the big contributors get the attention, don't they? Look what happened in the last presidential election. Look at the pardons that came down. Look at the amount of money nobody can prove anything as far as quid pro quo, but all of a sudden there's all this money and this person gets pardoned. And so it's not enough to know the technical, official, formal, legal process, because it's a real serious political process that is in the middle between what goes in and what comes out. Now, it's good to know that our system, for the most part, is relatively clean. And I say that because when I first started practicing law many, many years ago, first couple of years that I practiced, I did criminal defense work, where I would represent people who were accused of a crime. And because it was here in Santa Ana and Orange County, a lot of my clients were Latinos, recent immigrants. And I'll never forget the shock in my face the first time I went to court. And as I was walking into court, the guy grabs my coat and he goes, Licenciado, attorney, before you go in, here's a little extra envelope for you. Why? You already paid your fee. No, for the judge. I can't afford jail time. What are you crazy? Put that away. Did you realize this? Put that away. No, but I want to make sure that by paying an attorney's fee, you're making sure you get full representation. Paying more is not going to change it. You're required to get the best, most aggressive representation with the standard fee, and you certainly can't give a judge any money. That's a crime. But you see, some people come from a situation where that does work. Now, for the most part, it doesn't work here. Although I think some of you might have, did anybody watch The Practice? Yeah. Did you see that one, where the judge was on the tape? Luckily, it's very, very rare, as opposed to very commonplace in other countries. And so, yeah, it works, but don't think for a minute that corruption and politics, even legitimate politics, doesn't have a place in the legal system. Now, one of the things we do, we take a break at what time?
Now.
Why don't we take a break? How long? 15 minutes?
Yeah.
Let's take 15 minutes. I am really sorry. I just realized I've been in and out of some legal projects, back in and out of the office and out of town, and I didn't actually read. My secretary told me about this and what it was, and I didn't read. Apparently, it indicated that the lecture was going to be on Hispanic rights or civil rights. And I certainly can immediately start telling you a whole lot about that. We could talk to you for hours about that, and I will go into it right now.
I have a question regarding voting rights. How about the Hispanics and Latinos that were in this country for 100 years? They always have voting rights.
Yeah, well, in every system that we've had, certainly before California was part of the U.S., when it was under Mexican rule, they did have a process for voting. They've had elections and things for years.
And they've never been denied, right?
Well, I can't say that because even in Mexico and Latin America, there's...
Well, I mean here in this country.
Well, when you say they've always had rights, citizens citizenship is required to vote. So to the extent that someone became a citizen decades ago, they could vote. And it's the same rule now. They could be here 30 years. Unless they become a resident first and then a citizen, you can't vote. But you know, the problem is not so much whether legally you're entitled to vote. It's a matter of practicality. When you analyze the voting rights and civil rights history in this country of Latinos, there are some similarities to other groups of immigrants. The Italians, for example. The Polish, you know, wherever there's large groups of immigrants, the law, first of all, is not always applied equally. I mean, I don't know what your experience is, but we all know, for example, that 100 years ago in the Deep South, it wasn't always perfect justice that came out of the other end when a black person was accused of a crime. Do we pretty much agree that that happened? And so the law might not have said, although sometimes the law actually did say, you know, black people can't do this, black people can't do that.
The law was controlled by the whites.
Yeah. But even after we came beyond that and the law didn't necessarily specify that blacks can't do something, the process that they went through sometimes, and even today we have that happening in small rural communities, whether it's Latinos or Chicanos, as we call themselves in Texas, or blacks in the Deep South. The biggest challenge to the legal system, in my opinion, is not so much just changing the law, because that obviously helps sometimes, but the process, the application of itself. And the weakness, the weak link in the system to me is the weaknesses of human beings. You know, the ignorance of human beings. That sometimes the law doesn't matter. You know, I mean, we all know now that that's true. People know that it's wrong to kill, and they kill. They know it's wrong to lie under oath, and they lie under oath. The problem and the risk to our society and the damage that we have, the fallout that we experience, is from people who are ignorant and prejudiced and biased and somehow filter into positions of authority. Remember the Rampart case up here in L.A.? Were you reading daily what was happening as it unfolded? I mean, it started out as this little seed of one bad guy, and by the time it was all over, there was a whole lot of bad guys, weren't there? And then when you started realizing the scope of the abuse, the scope of the criminality, I mean, it was just horrendous. And I don't know what the last estimate is, like hundreds of defendants now are having to be let go. To a judge?
Huh?
Are you a judge?
I'm retired now.
God, I envy you.
Took around 30 years, you'll make it.
Okay, I hope so. And so, when you talk about civil rights problems, issues, violations, all of those things were a way of life. They were just the way people did things. I was involved in a major international treaty case many years ago, late 70s. And I had a chance to involve myself in a very intriguing class action case involving over 4,000 claimants. They were the descendants of Mexicans who lived in Texas, 26 million acres, now the King Ranch and all that. And these, bless you, these were descendants of Mexicans who lived and owned land at the time that it was annexed and became Texas. And to read the handwritten ledgers and journals, the day-to-day account of people. Remember, this is 1845, 1848, when we had the war with Mexico, right? And so you're living as a Mexican citizen in Mexico. And one day you come out of your home, still same house, same land, same place, and now you're living in the U.S. Think about the impact. If tomorrow morning you walked outside, everything is the same, but you're now part of Canada or part of Mexico. Talk about culture shock, right? We didn't cross the border crossed us. Right? And the complications that brought about, because there was a treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Everybody knows about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Many hundreds of sections. But the critical ones is dealing with these people who heretofore lived in Mexico and live in the same house and now live in the United States. And what do you do with them, right? The treaty said you have some options. First of all, your land rights, property rights are to be respected. You still own that house. You still own that land. However, you are living in the U.S., so you have an option. You can become a U.S. citizen. You can stay a Mexican citizen. But you still have your land. And so some people opted to become U.S. citizens. The reason I was involved in this legal case is because these 4,000 descendants of the original 433 claimants of this massive land grant situation, had documented a series of abuses. What happened was white settlers were coming in from the east. And of course now with the emotion of the time that basically, remember the Alamo, and these people were bad, and you know, they're foreigners and they don't even speak our language, and they're backward and primitive, and they don't have to, and before you know it, they felt, and again, I'm talking about a very small percentage of people, just like today. We've got a bunch of people in Orange County Jail, 5,000 people there. It's not representative of our county, but there are 5,000 bad people in that jail, right? The same thing then. It only took a percentage, 1-2% of the people that were coming in to feel somehow justified in attacking and taking over by force sometimes the land at gunpoint. They say, you know, why should Jose Martinez own 55 acres? After all, he's a Mexican, they've been defeated, and I came all the way from Ohio, and the free and home of the brave. Get the guns out. And before you know it, they march them out, they go, and people were documenting all this over all these years. And so, at some point, the way I got involved was, we had about 4,000 people, and by the way, how do you get 4,000 people to all get together and say, let's hire a lawyer, and let's let it be a Chicano lawyer named Jess Araujo in Santa Ana, California? Long, intriguing story, too long to tell you, but the way it started was, remember that was 1848-ish when it started happening, and it happened for years and years and years. All the way up until the Mexican Revolution, 1910. During their revolution, Mexico had a bunch of bad guys. Because this is war, internal war, but it's war. And in war, people do a lot of things they don't do when it's not war. So along the northern border, Mexican revolutionaries, they needed food, they'd come into the U.S. and they'd take food from people. They needed horses, they'd steal horses from people. They needed grain, whatever, they just take them. And so now the American people started writing their own journal. Well, today, 52 desperados from Mexico took all our grain. And so they started writing all that down. And before you know it, we have a bunch of people in Mexico writing about what happened to them at the hands of the white settlers. And then you have a bunch of American people saying what happened to them at the hands of the Mexican revolutionaries who came and wreaked havoc and broke the laws here. And at some point, there had to be a need to vindicate those rights on both sides. And that was done by a series of treaties between the countries. There was originally a treaty in 1923 that recognized that there was two sets of claims, Mexicans against the U.S. government, American citizens against the Mexican government, and they formed a claims commission to actually investigate, take proof, evaluate, and set up and establish a process to compensate these, no longer the claimants, the descendants of those claimants, right? Because this is many, many years later. The way the Mexicans identified and found these people is all the Mexican consulates in the Southwest. The biggest one was San Antonio. Actually would print ads, and they would do flyers and post things on board. And they said, we're looking for anybody who has a claim against the United States for violations of law under the Treaty of Guadalupe, land, property, lives. And so people would come out and say, oh yeah, my Uncle Pepe said that this and that, and they brought their records out and they started documenting. And of course the U.S. wasn't hard to find at all. They just basically do announcements in the media. Anybody who has a complaint against the Mexican government for any kind of abuses by Mexicans, and they flocked in and signed them up right there. And so in 1923, they entered into a treaty, September 8, 1923, that said, we now have a claims commission on both sides that will establish a criteria for developing the claims, evaluating which ones are valid, evaluating them monetarily, and then establishing a system for solving the problem. 1941 is the last treaty that says, now that we know what it is, we will now come up with the answer to it. And the answer to it was, we will evaluate the totality of the claims, and we will do a country-to-country credit. So imagine, $100 million of claims of U.S. against Mexico, $70 million of Mexico against U.S., country to country now. Mexico basically didn't have as many claims as the U.S., right? And so what they did was they said, now every country, these are no longer going to be international claims. Each country has to compensate their own claimants. And there was a set-off for the difference in value. It was the other way around, by the way. Mexico's claims were a little bit more than the U.S. claims. So the U.S. government paid Mexico like $17 million because of the difference in the value of the claims. And then Mexico, from that point, the Mexicans had to look to Mexico, the U.S. had to look to the U.S., American citizens, instead of having international claims. I got involved because those descendants of the Mexican claims said, we got gypped. Prior to this treaty, we had a solvent defendant that would probably pay us, the U.S. government. At the end of the switch, now we've got to look to Mexico to pay. Well, what are the odds they're going to ever pay me? Now, they were right, weren't they? The U.S., by the way, ended up paying their claimants 10 cents on the dollar for their claims. The Mexicans, to this day, haven't been paid. I was involved with a case for maybe 8 years. Went up to the United States Supreme Court on this case. Because when Mexico wouldn't voluntarily agree to pay, remember, originally the U.S. owed these people, but now under the treaty, Mexico had to pay. When Mexico refused to pay, they kept saying, we recognize it's our obligation, and when the conditions of the Treasury permit, we will formulate a plan for payment. They've been telling our clients that for 50 years. And so finally, we negotiated with Secretary of State in Mexico several times, almost had it settled. And President Carter, who was in office at the time, sent a memorandum down there when he heard about our efforts and that we were about to settle. You know, about a month before his visit, he was trying to lay the groundwork for a goodwill visit. And he thought that our efforts might upset the Mexicans or some sort. He sent a memo down there saying, by the way, we just want you to know that whatever claims are being asserted against you, that's a threat to your treasury, please don't feel compelled diplomatically to spend any money because we know that you're hurting, and I'm going to be there next month anyway. And so that kind of changed the dynamics of the negotiations. They basically felt that the U.S. government was blessing them to not pay. At that point, we changed gears and filed in the United States federal court under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. You know, there's jurisdiction in the United States to file against a foreign country. I don't know if you guys know that. Iranian, for example, how can you sue somebody? How can you sue the country of Iran and freeze their bank accounts here? Well, that's under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. See, because foreign countries are sovereigns, right? And usually you don't have any jurisdiction to sue them here. But if they have assets here, you've got jurisdiction over the assets, don't you? And so now you say, under certain rules, if you can prove that you qualify, and you can show assets here, and of course Mexico has a lot of assets here. You can take 1727, and that would pay a lot of it right there, right? So we knew that if we could get a judgment, we'd go out and the marshal could, you know, strap down the airplanes. But unfortunately, politics entered into it. Got up to the United States Supreme Court on the issue of foreign sovereign immunities, and basically the court said, no, we don't believe this is a case that Mexico can be subjected to our jurisdiction. We are convinced that it was a political decision. We still have the transcripts of the ruling, of the arguments, of the rulings and everything. The Supreme Court personally commended each of us, personally the lawyers, in writing for the great job we did. I think that they had a lot of remorse in ruling the way they did. I think they knew that the equities in the law was there, but sometimes it doesn't come out your way. It might sound like sour grapes, but I got to tell you that after reading the law and the facts and the proof, I'm convinced that in a different political moment, that could have gone the other way, and probably should have gone the other way. Sorry it took so long on that one, yes.
What happened to the money that the United States paid to Mexico?
Mexico used it for road improvements and manufacturing things. They used it well, actually. You know. Yeah, it didn't trickle down to the people. If that's your point, it didn't. No, because there was no strings attached. It's basically, this is a country-to-country transfer. Now you assume the obligation to those claimants on your side. We'll assume the obligation to our side. Question? Yes.
I was sort of confused on that, on the treaty called Araujo regarding clause about bilingualism in California, that it was guaranteed in political situations or something?
Well, it does have a provision for people to be allowed to continue speaking the language. That's true. It's either one. In other words, you would not be deprived of your right to speak your language. It was Spanish.
Right.
And that was a treaty that applied to the United States.
But that it doesn't address anything in terms of like specifics like balance or driving tests or anything like that.
No, but
Guarantee that you have the right to your language.
you're right. But because of that precedent and that legal principle, lawyers have been able to fine-tune what it means. Much like three strikes, it came out as a big general statement, and then people say, but does that mean that even the pizza? Well, let's go up to the Supreme Court. No, not pizza. But does that mean that the judge has no role? Well, let's see. Go up to the... No, the judge does have a role. And little by little, you put the teeth on the fish, yeah. Okay, now, as far as general civil rights go, everybody here, I can see, like me, remembers 1965 Civil Rights Act. That's the official law that finally said under the federal law, we are compelled to respect the rights of blacks and by extension other minorities. The Voting Rights Act also, 60s. The 60s is where there was finally a social awakening, when the soldiers had been working long enough to finally hit pay dirt. You know, the struggles started way before that. Anybody ever heard of Dr. Julian Nava? No? Julian Nava? Yeah, he's a good friend of mine. And in the early 70s, 71, 72-ish, he was an activist. I was an activist. I was the first president of MECHA at Santa Ana College. The first, it used to be, before that it was called UMAS, United Mexican American Students, which was kind of like a glee club at the time. But I came out of the Marine Corps in '69 with all kinds of things going through my head after having been through the Vietnam experience, the Texas experience. Usually those of us that came here from other states had a different social acuity than California Chicanos did. And the reason is because the extreme nature of the problem was different. California has always been cutting edge. There's been problems here, don't get me wrong. The farm labor movement is a perfect example. Cesar Chavez, who I got to work with several times. But it just, on a day-to-day basis, you can't compare the California Chicano experience to Texas, Arizona, New Mexico. It's just a whole different ballgame. And so those people that came here from other states were much more motivated to listen to the social awakening movement and be recruited into it and saying, do you know it? Do you feel it? Are you willing to be a soldier? And so that gave rise to organizations. MECHA was one. MALDEF's another. MALDEF is a major civil rights organization now. LULAC is another one, 1929 out of San Antonio, Texas. And little by little, the mid-60s is what gave rise to that coalition, not just of minorities, by the way. Over half the people in the organizations I belong to were not. They were white. You know? Because good people come in all colors, and they can relate to issues. They say, you know what? It's not right that you can't have somebody who's a chancellor of the university. It's not right that you can't have a chief of police. It's not right that you can't have a mayor or city council, especially when you're 80% of the population. And so these people say, it's wrong. Count me in. I'm a soldier with you. And to this day, many of the organizations I belong to, you walk in and there's every color and religion and political inclination there is, because we have one thing in common. We look at the equation and say, this isn't right. This isn't right, so what are we going to do about it? Many organizations I belong with have nothing to do with being Chicano or Latino. It's just the right thing to do. You know, I sit on the school board for the High School of the Arts. Nothing to do with being Chicano or Latino. We need more kids in the arts. We knocked it out of the school district in the budget a long time ago. Somebody's got to come up with it. It matters. It matters because it enhances our way of life, our civilization, our society. It doesn't matter what color you are or what language you are. Yes, sir.
I'm not quite clear. What is the difference in culture in Texas and California?
Referring to Latinos.
Yeah.
Okay. The first experience I got here when I was stationed here in El Toro, again, I grew up in El Paso. And my first weekend, I got Liberty. Got together with 4 or 5 other Texans, Tejanos. Got together in my old 59 Volkswagen and said, well, this is our first weekend in town, guys. Let's do it. Nothing but orange groves at the time going to El Toro. So it was like about a half-hour drive to nothing but oranges to get to Santa Ana. We're so excited because when we came here and on the bus going to the base, we saw a lot of Chicano-looking people out there. This is just like home. I can't wait to get out and experience Santa Ana. And the first stop we made, and you see somebody and say, ¿Qué pasó a todo? ¿Dónde está el mono? And they go, pardon me? I'm looking at this guy, he looks just like me, like my brother. ¿Dónde está el mono ese? Excuse me? And I thought, culture shock that just hit me. This guy could have been my brother and didn't understand a word I was saying. And that was just the beginning. That was just the language difference, okay? Then when you get into the culture of poverty, I mean, there's poverty, then there's poverty, okay? Totally different levels of poverty, okay? California has always been more advanced, okay? The problems are never so extreme. I had cousins that grew up in the LA area, Pomona area, Van Nuys area. And they'd come and spend a couple of weeks in El Paso, and then we'd come and spend a couple of weeks with them. And it was like day and night. We loved coming. They hated going. They thought, why in the heck would you guys live in this godforsaken place? This is our home. Yeah, but why is it your home? You know? And so the attitude was different. Yes?
I'm sure or read somewhere that the Mexican Americans were much more politically effective
Very much so.
compared to California.
Very much so.
And why is that?
Because there was a more urgent and imminent need. I can just tell you, when I lived there and when I moved here, why do you think I said I'm not going back? You're getting out of the Marine Corps tomorrow. Yes, I am, but I'm staying right here in Orange County, California. Because it's a lot better life. Everything from the standard of living, the wages. Now, the one thing that probably is more advanced there is the political organization. And that has to do with the fact, remember, if you go to a border town like El Paso, I live 2-3 miles from the border, in a high school for lunchtime, we'd go up Costa Zaragoza and have tacos and come back for fifth period. And that's how it was. You know? I don't see that in San Diego and Tijuana. I don't see the kids saying, hey, this is great, I'm going to go to Tijuana. Doesn't happen. And it's because the disparity of lifestyle and affluence is so much different that they say, why would I go to Tijuana when I can go to the Coronado Hotel with my girlfriend? What's going to impress her? That or Ciro's in Tijuana. And so those things influence us. But you're right that the political movement was far more advanced in Texas. The famous Crystal City case, Crystal City, Texas case. The first just patently successful effort to organize Latinos over a perceived injustice on the school board. Basically, I don't know if you know the story. Crystal City, what happened is they have a high school, 80% Latinos, all of the cheerleaders are white. One Latina tries to become a cheerleader. I wasn't there, so I can't tell you, but they said that objectively, she qualified every bit as much as anybody else. And they said, no, you can't be a cheerleader. Parents were outraged. They stormed City Hall. They stormed the school district. They said, those are the rules. These are the judges, blah, blah, blah. And they said, who gets to vote? The school board. And they voted. Okay, then we'll change the school board. Next school board election, everybody out. Brown faces in. And to this day, that's been an example of political organization at its best in the Latino community. Hasn't been duplicated quite that well yet. We got a smidgen of something approaching to that, 1996, where Sanchez gets elected. Lou Correa gets elected. Gets re-elected by larger margin second time out. No doubt that politically, there is a substantial, probably irreversible demographic change that's going to impact California as you've seen it already. The complexion of elections, elected officials, and ultimately issues, because politicians deal with issues that become laws later, right? And so you're going to see that now, even though Texas started out more advanced, now Latinos are more advanced here. We have more in numbers, more in buying power. The nature of our positions are just more influential. I still respect and admire my Texas brothers and sisters, believe me, but California is now the cutting edge. There's no doubt about it. It's scary for people because it's hard to understand how all of us, so you read the editorials, you read, especially in Orange County, you read the stuff that comes in there, right? About immigration, for example. It's like, what's happening here? We're losing our country. All the initiatives, you know, the initiatives that deal with Latino issues. A few minutes left. Which is the one that comes to mind as the most significant issue, proposition in the past 10 years? 187, right? 187. And people ask me, Jess, you're a lawyer, how can you defend this system? We have an election in California, and, you know, 68% of the people say yes on 187. We don't want illegals in our schools. We want to make sure that teachers have a legal obligation to report even a suspected illegal to INS. And we pass it, and lo and behold, it never took effect. Two little minion judges just overrode the population of California voters, and where is the justice here? How do you explain it? Now, is this a democracy or what? I mean, does a majority rule or what? And what's the answer to that? Anybody? Yeah, but you see, the beauty of our system is that majorities can't always win. There are some things too important to leave to the passions and prejudices of the majority. Can we all take a majority vote right now that we can invoke slavery again tomorrow? Do you think we can? We can't. No. You can't. I mean, it's incredible. If you said, you know, every Democrat now, since you're outnumbered, you can only work part-time. Let's take an Orange County vote. In Orange County alone now, we're going to take a county vote. We're going to pass an ordinance. If you're a Democrat, since we know we outnumber you, you can only work half-time. Could you do that because you're a majority? There are parameters on it, aren't there? And it's based on decency and integrity and constitutional principles that oblige us to not do something that violates those standards, even against a minority. And so, 187? Of course you can't just accept any willy-nilly thing that the people are dumb enough to pass. I mean, no offense to anybody, but we do some dumb things in Orange County when it comes to propositions. And that was one of them. And so rightfully so, they take it up, they give it to the courts, they analyze it, whether it violates. So by the way, that case had been decided in Texas under the Plyer case in 1982 already. They tried to do that in 1982. The Supreme Court then said you can't do it. Immigration is uniquely a federal issue. It's preempted. You cannot deal with immigration issues. We don't care. We'll bang our chests. We'll get Pete Wilson, I'm sorry, another tour of duty here. And of course, he did at least get that. He got another tour of duty because he was very popular. But there has to be safeguards. When you're dealing with a minority community, blacks, Latinos, Asians, immigrants, you always have to try to find the legal niche hole that you can hang your hat on. And then you've got to struggle not just with the law, but the implementation of it in the process of the law. And that is a very, very big challenge. The voting system, let me tell you, the legal system and the voting system in this country is to be admired. On paper, it's to be admired. But our own human nature is our biggest enemy. Because we don't use the process. You know what the vote turnout was this last election?
40,
March 5th?
40%?
It's 38%. Can you imagine? I have a class of 60 students that I teach every Tuesday night. And voting and electoral rights is part of our class agenda throughout the class. So on the first night of class, this is a night class, 7 to 9:45. And I was a night student. I commuted to law school in the evening, so I know what it's like to be a night student. And somewhere along the orientation at the beginning of the class, I look out at them and I say, now we're going to talk about the most important subject, the thing that's the most important, compelling question in your minds right now as we speak. What is that? Who can tell me what it is? And right away, a bunch of hands go up. And what do you think that question is? Yes. Do we take a break and get out at 9:45, or do we not take a break and get out at 9:30? That is, and they admit it. That's the most compelling question in my mind right now. And so I said, okay, I am big on democracy. We're going to do this democratically. Who knows what that means? And somebody said, does that mean we get to vote? I'm like, well, yes, we get to vote. Let's take a vote right now. How many of you want to have no break and get out at 9:30? All the hands go up. And I go, that is such an exemplary way of looking at the democratic process. We had an election, everybody voted. Now, that was just a dry run, people. The real election is going to be this coming Saturday at 6 a.m. at the Titan Center. How many of you are going to be there? How many hands do you think go up? None. And I go, this is boggling my mind. I can't understand it. A minute ago it was 100% voter participation. And now it's 0. And the same question of whether we're going to have... I said, okay, we're going to change it. One more thing. Why don't we have the election on Saturday morning at 6? We're going to actually have 2 issues on the ballot. One is the break to break or not to break. And the other one is, do we have to have a final exam? Now, how many of you will be here? All hands go up again. And I say, you know, I am now totally perplexed. You guys are just confusing me. 5 minutes ago, you're all in. 2 minutes ago, you're all out. And now you're all in again. But see, this is voter dynamics. I say, why? Tell me why. You voted yes, then no, then yes again. And what was it? Well, convenience, the second time was convenience. I'm not going to get up to be here by 6 for the break.
How
But the
important it
issue-
was, yeah.
See, the last one really mattered, didn't it? I mean, that really matters. To go through a class and not have to take a final exam, that's big stuff. And for that, I'll be here at 6 o'clock, right? I bet I could have said 4 o'clock and they would have been here. And see, in real life, it's the same problem we have. How do I get every one of you to feel that the issues are so important that you don't care what time it is? Because I always tell them, say, how many voted the last election? Yeah, very few, right? And I say, let me ask you something. Was it because it was too expensive to vote? I mean, was it real expensive to get out and vote? Or was it that you only had like half hour and you had to go to San Clemente to vote? Is it like your vote only counts a third of what everybody else's counts? Well, then why is it that you don't vote? Because Lord knows people in the rest of the world would love to have it, right? And so all these issues are always going to come down to the bottom line is what does it take to make you feel it's important enough to inconvenience yourself or work for it? Though I think that technology, as is a double-edged sword, television is a double-edged sword. Television is very good for sharing information, but it can be abused and the wrong kind of information comes out because it's the great money divide. I'll give you an example, a pathetic example of perverting the electoral process. I will tell you up front so I don't abuse my platform, and that is that I believe very strongly in certain issues. I'm a trial lawyer. I believe that people have to have access to courts in the civil justice system. There was a ballot on the proposition. It was called Proposition 30. Does anybody remember Proposition 30? Last election, not this past March, but the election before, Prop 30. For some reason, 68% of the population, of the voters in this state voted, yeah, Prop 30. Well, Prop 30, it said the following. It involved insurance companies in the state of California. For many years, we had what we called a bad faith insurance law that said, if an insurance company does these certain things, it's bad. They can't lie to you. They can't misrepresent coverage. They can't stall you till statute of limitations. All these things that can happen, if they do that and you prove it, you can sue the insurance company for bad faith. And so, many times that was happening. It was being proved and they were having to pay money. And they didn't like that. So what they did was, under a different administration, they were able to change it and say there is no longer bad faith in California, at least as to third parties. If you rear-end me and I'm dealing with your insurance company, I couldn't sue your insurance company for dealing in bad faith with me. You could with your own company. If your own company lied to you, you could sue them. But another victim of your insurance company's bad faith now could not do it. Well, with that kind of teeth gone, what do you think happened now when insurance companies learn there's no more bad faith? What do you think happened next time the phone rings? I need my car fixed and it's going to cost $2,000. Did you see there's no more bad faith? Okay, he's out to lunch, but he'll be back next week. Actually, he'll be back 2 weeks from now. He'll call you by. Everything started immediately. The wheels started grinding differently because they didn't have the threat of bad faith. Immediately, the victims bar, the people who represent victims of this, started saying, this is crazy to not have bad faith. Look what's going on. We're back to the primitive days. And started lobbying to get bad faith again. Change of administration happens. Now, thank God, there's going to be a chance for bad faith again. Assembly and the Senate passed a new bad faith law. The governor signs it. We thank God we have bad faith again, right? No. Proposition goes on the ballot called Prop 30. Now the voters are being asked to vote to cancel bad faith. You are being asked to cancel the law that says if an insurance company deals in bad faith with you, you can sue them for it. Now, what are the odds that they're going to get you to vote for that?
Don't read it and don't pay attention to it.
What are the odds that you're going to say, okay, I agree, from now on, if you violate my rights, I can't sue you. In fact, it's not really a violation at all. Count me in, yes. 68% of us voted yes. Why? I remember still, shaving in the morning with CNN on or TV on, and I see these commercials start coming out about a month before the election. And basically, they show a bunch of wolves going on the screen. Don't let the wolf lawyers take advantage of you. Vote no on Prop 30, right? And then they show these two guys sitting in a bar with beers, and one guy goes, look at this, Charlie. See that? That's how I got my money. I just pretended like there was an accident, put in a claim, got my money. That had nothing to do with Prop 30. Staged accidents is against the law, already, and you go to jail for it. It had nothing to do with Prop 30. Prop 30 was giving up your right to sue people to the insurance company for bad faith. And yet people didn't make the connection. They just figured that is definitely wrong. What? How am I supposed to vote? Yeah, that is definitely wrong. And I'll vote that way. So until we as an electorate start putting forth the time and the effort, we're going to continue to have the Prop 30s of our history come down and wipe out our rights. We're down to just a couple of minutes. Were there any questions that I can answer before we adjourn? Yes.
Probably the biggest election we've had in this county for years has been the one with the representative Jess against Dorn.
Dorn?
I'm sure you know him, know her personally.
Yes, she's a good friend of mine.
How is she doing since she's been?
She's doing very well, doing very well. In fact, she's doing so well, you always know when someone's doing well and doing good work, because not everybody's happy. See, it's wrong to expect Loretta Sanchez to, just because you supported her, to vote your way on every issue there is. She represents the whole district. All people, all colors, all religions, all parties. And so she's had to make some votes that, for the majority of her district, go one way, even though her personal constituency might not be there. And I've been in the room when she's had to say, you know what? I represent the whole district.
What about her sister, though? Did that make her sister qualified?
Well, definitely. Obviously, nobody can be qualified because of a sister.
Well,
Whether that's the whole different issue that's going to have to be determined by her. When you talk about qualifications for Congress, we get in big trouble. You know, we've got 435 people in the House and 100 senators, right? First time elected people. If you look really at their qualifications, you'd be surprised how many. Like Loretta. She had run for city council and lost, and then ran for Congress. If you go across the country, the 435, there's many people who have little experience. It's a political game. You know, can you raise the money? Can you get the endorsements? Can you get out the vote? Look what happened with Condit. The guy was a sure-in for life until the Chandra Levy case broke, and now you saw what the election happened. Politics is really about persuading people to vote for you, sometimes having little to do with qualifications. Let me give you 2 minutes, in our closing 2 minutes, for one last thing I'll tell you. Yes?
this has got nothing to do with any of this.
Okay?
This has to do with Andrea Gates. According to one of the commentators, Texas juries are not allowed to hear that if someone is just mentally unfit, they can have treatment in a hospital, possibly for life. That is either they have to be voted guilty the way she was, or be set free, which is what juries think. Now, it seems archaic that mental illness is treated that way.
I couldn't agree with you more. I got to level with you. Reasonable minds can differ. My partner disagrees with me. I got to see the closing arguments on both sides of the case. I was personally just flabbergasted. I know reasonable minds can differ. But somebody said it best. They said, if this case doesn't establish insanity, there is no such thing. And so your question or your comment, if juries cannot know that by voting not guilty by reason of insanity, they're going to go to treatment, they're not going to walk the streets, does that impact their willingness to vote not guilty? I think that's your point, right? I think without a doubt it's a major factor that people would reasonably take into account. But that being the case in Texas, I mean, that's the situation that we're dealing with.
They're calling this a killer jury.
Well, you certainly can glean some conclusion from the fact that they came out within 4 hours on a case with so many complexities. But it's a sad situation, really sad. Those are the kind of cases that make all of us, lawyers and judges and non-lawyers alike, just wince at the responsibility of society to deal with these horrendous issues and you wonder if you did the right thing. Now, of course, we're now facing the death penalty issue. So think about when that comes out. Think of the options there in this case. That is why the legal system, knowledge of the legal system, and applying it correctly is so important, because it impacts society, our values, and the nature of our lives by doing it right. And when it becomes gamesmanship, one more conviction, unfortunately, it's going to impact us for a long, long time. Any other comments? Yes.
Does the judge in that particular case have any discretion of overturning, say it was a death penalty?
I don't know about Texas law. Here in California, they can. In California, a judge can overrule the death penalty and give you life without parole. But that's a specific California statute. I'm not sure if Texas has it. Any other questions? It's been a pleasure being with you today. Thank you for having me.
Sitting too long.
You're very welcome.